Alrighty, sorry about the delay. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and today we're going to be reading more of Permutation City. We will resume our reading of Permutation City, because last week we had a brief break to read a Christmas story. A probably inappropriate Christmas story, but people will just be happy with that. It's a cute one, that one by Charles Stross. Alrighty. Oh wow, we got a bunch of people tuning in already. Yowza! Frank Misers and Liz Angel, hello to you both. So previously on, let's see, Maria Deluca gets her dream job, which is fairly abstract stuff working with virtual systems, virtual environments, virtual ecologies. In fact, her job is to create the rough outline of starting conditions that could make life in a digital realm, digital life, using the autoverse, uh, basically, and its rules. And she is on her way to doing this. Unfortunately, she's run into a bit of a roadblock in that our boy Paul Durham is being investigated for cyber fraud because what he is offering to a bunch of really wealthy copies is patently impossible. There's no way it can be true. He's offering for a flat $2 million, fun bucks, um, their own home away from home, secure, ultimately secure, the ultimate secure place to live with no fear of having their cycles drained or slowed, and no fear of being taken down or offline by an angry, rebelling populace of the proletariat who are sick and tired of these eccentric, wealthy people having immortality while everybody else starves to death, which is an understandable reaction, if an extreme one. Um, but what he's offering is just nonsense, and so the fraud squad has come to Maria Deluca, who's like, there's no way. What he's doing is just, it's too obviously a fraud to be anything but legitimate. And the fraud squad's like, really though? And she's like, okay, sure, really. Um, okay, fair. And they're like, well, if you help us, we won't press charges against you. There might even be a reward in it for you for cooperating. And so she's like, she has no real choice. So she has become a narc very much against her own will. The practical upshot is that she gets to keep doing what she's doing, um, which is good, but with the full knowledge that it is going to come to an end. Um, the thing that's important to note here is that while Mr. Durham may or may not be a fraudster, he has kept up his end of his contract with her. He has paid her, she is being paid, all her bills are going through for autoverse time, all that. So he has not shafted her, which is, of course, what makes her look so much like a co conspirator. Um, so she's in a tough spot. And that is, I think, occurring in the 2051 portion of this, right? Let me just double check. Yes, that is occurring in February of 2021. 2051. It's not so far off. Now imagine if we were using all the hardware that we're burning on this bogus AI garbage, generative AI nonsense, and put it towards, I don't know, medical brain scans. We could get there. We could be there by 2050. I believe it. We could be at this future reality. But we're not going to do that. So there's no point getting all happy and excited about it, or unhappy and excited about it. So, because we live in current time era and current timeline, which is not the best of timelines. Um, but by technical definition, it is not. We do not live in a dystopia. You see, a dystopia requires that your setting be fictional. That's what keeps it from being a dystopia. Good times. Anyway, hopefully in later news, we can get reading. So give me one sec here. I'm going to get some water in me, and we'll get rolling. Chapter 14. Remit Not Paucity. February 2051. Seated in his library, Thomas viewed the final report in his knowledge miner's selection from the last real-time week of news. A journalist in a fur-lined coat appeared to address the camera, standing in a light snow in front of the U.S. Supreme Court building, although she was more likely to have been seated in a warm studio, watching a software puppet mime to her words. Today's 5-to-1 majority decision means that the controversial Californian statute will remain in force. Authorities taking possession of computer storage media to check for simulations of the brain, body, or personality of a suspected felon, dead or alive, are not violating the Fourth Amendment rights of either the next of kin or the owners of the computer hardware. Chief Justice Andrea Steiner stressed that the ruling does not affect the status of copies themselves one way or another. The software, she said, can be confiscated and examined, but it will not stand trial. The terminal blinked back to a menu. Thomas stretched his arms above his head, acutely conscious for a moment of the disparity between his frail appearance and the easy strength he felt in his limbs. He had become his young self again, after all, become him in the flesh, whether or not he chose to face him in the mirror. But the thought led nowhere. Thomas had been following the saga of the Californian legislation from the start. He hoped Sanderson and her colleagues knew what they were doing. If their efforts backfired, it could have unpleasant ramifications for copies everywhere. Thomas's own public opinion model had shrugged its stochastic shoulders and declared that the effects of the law could go either way, depending on the steps taken to follow through, and several other factors, most of which would be difficult to anticipate or manipulate. Clearly, the aim was to shock apathetic U.S. voters into supporting human rights for copies, lest the alternative be de facto kidnap, mind pillage, and possibly even execution, all without trial. The computer literate would understand just how useless the law would be in practice, but they'd already been largely won over. The unclear family rated highest with the demographics least likely to grasp the technical realities, a storehouse of goodwill that had yet to be fully exploited. The Unclear Family being the fictional in-universe TV show about a family of copies. Thomas could see the possibilities. Resurrected blue-collar worker Larry Unclear could turn out to have been under suspicion of murder at the time of his death. Flashback. Misunderstanding in bar leads to heated, highly visible argument between Larry and guest star X. Comic escalation to full-scale brawl. Taking advantage of the confusion, guest star Y smashes a bottle over the skull of guest star X, while Larry, with his usual endearing ineffectuality, has ended up comatose under a table. The new law could see him dragged from his home and family in the dead of night for a Kafkaesque virtual interrogation, in which his guilty dreams of being responsible are taken to be memories of actually committing the crime, while guest star Y, still a living human, receives a civilized trial, lies through his teeth, and is acquitted. Son Leroy could save the day somehow, at the last minute, as usual. Thomas closed his eyes and buried his face in his hands. Most of the room ceased being computed. He pictured himself adrift in Durham's sea of random numbers, carrying the chair and a fragment of floor with him, the only objects granted solidity by his touch. He said, "Oh, wait a minute. Yes, no, this is the character I thought it was. He said, 'I'm not in any danger.'" The room flickered halfway back into existence, subtly modified the sound of his words, then dissolved into static again. Who did he believe would actually accuse him? There was no one left to care about Anna's death. He'd outlived them all. But as long as the knowledge of what he'd done continued to exist inside him, he could never be certain that it wouldn't be revealed. For months after the crime, he'd dreamed that Anna had come to his apartment. He'd wake, sweating and shouting, staring into the darkness of his room, waiting for her to show herself. Waiting for her to tear the skin of normality from the world around him, to reveal the proof of his damnation: blood, fire, insanity. Then he'd started rising from his bed when the nightmares woke him, walking naked into the shadows, daring her to be there, willing it. He'd enter every room in the apartment, most of them so dark he had to feel his way with an outstretched hand, waiting for her fingers suddenly to mesh with his. Night after night she failed to appear, and gradually her absence became a horror in itself, vertiginous, icy. The shadows were empty, the darkness was indifferent. Nothing lay beneath the surface of the world. He could have slaughtered 100,000 people, and the night would still have failed to conjure up a single apparition to confront him. He wondered if this understanding would drive him mad. It didn't. After that, his dreams had changed. There were no more walking corpses. Instead, he dreamed of marching into Hamburg police station and making a full confession. Thomas stroked the scar on the inside of his right forearm, where he'd scraped himself on the brickwork outside the window of Anna's room, making his clumsy escape. No one, not even Ilse, had ever asked him to account for it. He'd invented a plausible explanation, but the lie had remained untold. He knew he could have his memories of the crime erased, edited out of his original scan file, his current brain model, his emergency snapshots. No other evidence remained. It was ludicrous to imagine that anyone would ever have the slightest reason, let alone the legal right, let alone the power, to seize and examine the data which comprised him. But if it eased his paranoid fears, why not? Why not neutralize his unease at the technical possibility of his mind being read like a book, or a ROM chip, by turning the metaphor, or near literal truth, to his own advantage? Why not rewrite the last incriminating version of his past? Other copies exploited what they'd become with inane sybaritic excesses. Why not indulge himself in some peace of mind? Why not? Because it would rob him of his identity. For 65 years, the tug on his thoughts of that one night in Hamburg had been as constant as gravity. Everything he'd done since had been shaped by its influence. To tear out the entire tangled strand of his psyche, rendering half of his remaining memories incomprehensible, would be to leave himself a baffled stranger in his own life. Of course, any sense of loss or disorientation could be dealt with too, subtracted out. But where would the process of amputation end? Who would remain to enjoy the untroubled conscience he'd manufactured? Who'd sleep the sleep of the just in his bed? Memory editing wasn't the only option. Algorithms existed which could transport him smoothly and swiftly into a state of enlightened acceptance, rehabilitated, healed, at peace with himself and his entire uncensored past. He wouldn't need to forget anything. His absurd fear of incrimination by mind reading would surely vanish, along with his other neuroses of guilt. But he wasn't prepared to swallow that fate either, however blessed he might have felt once the transformation was complete. He wasn't sure that there was any meaningful distinction between redemption and the delusion of redemption, but some part of his personality, though he cursed it as masochistic and sentimental, balked at the prospect of instant grace. Anna's killer was dead. He'd burned the man's corpse. What more could he do to put the crime behind him? On his deathbed, as his illness had progressed, as he'd flirted giddily every morning with the prospect of ordering his final scan, he'd felt certain that witnessing the fate of his body would be dramatic enough to purge him of his stale, mechanical, relentless guilt. Anna was dead. Nothing could change that. A lifetime of remorse hadn't brought her back. Thomas had never believed that he'd earned the right to be free of her, but he'd come to realize that he had nothing left to offer the little tin metronome in his skull but an extravagant ritual of atonement, the death of the murderer himself. But the murderer had never really died. The corpse consigned to the furnace had been nothing but shed skin. 2 days before being scanned, Thomas had lost his nerve, and countermanded his earlier instructions, that his flesh and blood self be allowed to regain consciousness after the scan. So, the dying human had never woken, never known that he was facing death, and there had been no separate, mortal Thomas Riemann to carry the burden of guilt into the flames. Thomas had met Anna in Hamburg in the summer of 1983 in a railway station cafe. He was in town to run errands for his father. She was on her way to West Berlin for a concert. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. The cafe was crowded. They shared a table. Anna's appearance wasn't striking. Dark-haired, green-eyed, her face round and flat. Thomas would never have looked twice at her if they'd passed in the street. But she soon made an impression. She looked him over appraisingly, then said, "I'd kill for a shirt like that. You have expensive tastes. What do you do to support them?" Thomas lied carefully. "I was a student, engineering, up until a few months ago. It was hopeless, though. I was failing everything." "So what do you do now?" He looked doleful. "My father owns a merchant bank. I went into engineering to try to get away from the family business, but—" She wasn't sympathetic at all. "But you screwed up, and now he's stuck with you?" "And vice versa." "Is he very rich?" "Yes." "And you hate him?" "Of course." She smiled sweetly. "Why don't I kidnap him for you? You give me all the inside information, and we'll split the ransom money 50-50. "You kidnap bankers for a living, do you?" "Not exclusively." "I think you work in a record store." "You're wrong." "Or a second-hand clothes shop." "You're getting colder." "Who are you meeting in Berlin?" "Just some friends." When her train was announced, he asked her for her number. She wrote it on the sleeve of his shirt. For the next few months, whenever he was traveling north, he phoned her. 3 times she made excuses. He almost gave up, but he kept recalling the mocking expression on her face, and he knew he wanted to see her again. Early in November, she finally said, "Drop round if you like. I'm not doing anything." He'd planned to take her to a nightclub, but she had a child with her, a baby just a few months old. "He's not mine. I'm looking after him for a friend." They watched TV, then had sex on the sofa. Climbing off him, Anna said, "You're really quite sweet." She kissed him on the cheek, then vanished into the bedroom, locking him out. Thomas fell asleep watching an old John Wayne movie. 2 teenage girls with smeared mascara pounded on the door around 2 in the morning, and Anna sold them of sachet, a plastic sachet of white powder. Thomas, still on the couch, asked her if the powder was heroin or cocaine. "Heroin." "Do you use that shit?" "No." She regarded him with mild amusement. She didn't care if he believed her or not. He woke again at 5:30. Anna had gone. The baby was still in his crib, screaming. Thomas changed him and fed him. Anna had shown him where everything was. He wanted a shower, but there was no hot water. He shaved and left in time for his meeting, telling himself Anna would be back soon. All morning and all through lunch he could smell the sour odor of the child's skin on his hands, and he wondered if the smiling property developers could smell it too. He phoned from the hotel, paying for the night he hadn't spent there, knowing that his father would scrutinize his expenses. Anna was home. He'd woken her. Someone nearby grunted with displeasure. Thomas didn't mention the child. The next time he came on a Saturday afternoon, with no need to be anywhere else in a hurry. They met at the Ulster Pavilion, drank their coffee down Wow. Drank their coffee looking down on the buffoons in rowboats on the Binnenalster. Then went shopping on the Jungfernstieg. Let's try that all again. They met at the Ulster Pavilion, drank their coffee, looking down on the buffoons in rowboats on the Binnenalster, and then went shopping on Jungfernstieg. Thomas paid for the clothes Anna chose, authentic Gothic designer trash that looked far worse than the cheapest imitation. It seemed she really didn't want to dress like him after all. They walked arm in arm from shop to shop, and in the entrance to the most expensive boutique they stopped and kissed for several minutes, blocking the way of customers trying to get past, then went in and spent a lot of money. Later, in a nightclub with a bad live band who dressed like the Beatles and did Sex Pistols covers, they ran into Martin, a tall, wiry blonde youth who Anna introduced as a friend. Martin was all vicious backslapping amiability, trying so hard to be intimidating that he was almost comical. They all staggered back to Anna's flat together and sat on the floor listening to records. When Anna went to the toilet, Martin drew a knife and told Thomas he intended to kill him. He was very drunk. Thomas stood up, kicked him once in the face, breaking his nose, then took away the knife and dragged him moaning out into the hall. Thomas turned him on his side so he wouldn't choke on the blood, then locked the door. Anna came out of the bathroom. Thomas told her what had happened. She went out and checked on Martin and put a pillow under his head. While Anna was undressing him, Thomas said, "On TV once I saw an English soldier who'd just come back from Northern Ireland, and he said it was hell there, but at least it was real. At least I've lived now." Thomas laughed sadly. "Ah, the poor fool had it all upside down. Slaughtering people is real, and living an ordinary life is some kind of dream, some kind of delusion. Poor fucked up kid." He searched Anna for needle marks, but he couldn't find a single one. Back in his office in Frankfurt, alone in his apartment, at the dinner table in his parents' home, Thomas thought about Anna, in images and scents. The memories never distracted him. He could carry on a conversation or keep reading a mortgage schedule while she played in his head like wallpaper music. His father cornered him at Easter. "You should think about getting married. It makes no difference to me, but there are social advantages you're going to need sooner or later. And think how happy it would make your mother." Mutter. Thomas said, "I'm 24 years old." "I was engaged when I was 24. "Maybe I'm gay, or perhaps I have an incurable venereal disease." "I don't see why either should be an obstacle." Thomas saw Anna every second weekend. He bought her whatever she asked for. Sometimes she had the child with her. The boy was called Eric. Thomas asked her, "Who's the mother? Have I met her?" She said, "You don't want to. You don't want to." He worried about her sometimes, afraid she'd get herself arrested or beaten up by junkies or rivals, but she seemed to be able to take care of herself. He could have hired private detectives to uncover the mysteries of her life and bodyguards to watch over her, but he knew that he had no right. He could have bought her an apartment, set her up with investments, but she never suggested anything of the kind, and he suspected she'd be deeply insulted if he made the offer. His gifts were lavish, but he knew she could have lived without them. They were using each other. She was, he told himself, as independent as he was. He wouldn't have said he loved her. He didn't ache when they were apart. He just felt pleasantly numb and looked forward to the next time he'd see her. He was jealous, but not obsessive, and she kept her other lovers out of the way. He rarely had to acknowledge their existence. He never saw Martin again. Anna traveled with him to New York. They fell asleep in the middle of a Broadway show, saw the Pixies play at the Mud Club, climbed the stairs to the top of Manhattan Chase. Thomas turned 25. His father promoted him. His mother said, "Look at all your gray hairs." In the spring, Eric disappeared. Anna said casually, "His mother's gone. She's moved away." Thomas was hurt. He'd liked having the boy around. He said, "You know, I used to think he might be yours." She was baffled. "Why? I told you he wasn't. Why would I have lied?" Thomas had trouble sleeping. He kept trying to picture the future. When his father died, would he still be seeing Anna once a fortnight in Hamburg, while she dealt heroin and fucked pimps and junkies? The thought made him sick. Not because he didn't want everything to stay the same, but because he knew that it couldn't. The Saturday in June was, almost, the second anniversary of the day they'd met. They went to a flea market in the afternoon, and he bought her cheap jewelry. She said, "Anything nicer would be asking for trouble." They ate junk food, went dancing. They ended up back at Anna's flat at 2:30. They danced around the tiny living room, propping each other up, more tired than drunk. Thomas said, "God, you're beautiful. Marry me." He didn't actually say marry me. It's in italics. Anna said, "I'm going to ask you for something I've never asked for before. I've been trying to work up the courage all day." "You can ask for anything." "Marry me." Same again. "I have a friend with a lot of cash. Almost 200,000 marks. He needs someone who can—" Thomas stepped back from her, then struck her hard across the face. He was horrified. He'd never hit her before. The thought had never even occurred to him. She started punching him in the chest and face. He stood there and let her do it for a while, then grabbed both her hands by the wrists. She caught her breath. "Let go of me." "I'm sorry." "Then let go of me." He didn't. He said, "I'm not a money laundering facility for your friends." She looked at him pityingly. "Oh, what have I done? Offended your high moral principles? All I did was ask. You might have made yourself useful. Never mind. I should have known it was too much to expect." He pushed his face close to hers. "Where are you going to be in 10 years' time? In prison? At the bottom of the Elbe?" "Fuck off." "Where? Tell me." She said, "I can think of worse fates. I could end up playing happy families with a middle-aged banker." Thomas threw her toward the wall. Her feet slipped from under her before she hit it. Her head struck the bricks as she was going down. He crouched beside her, disbelieving. There was a wide gash in the back of her head. She was breathing. He patted her cheeks, then tried to open her eyes. They'd rolled up into her skull. She'd ended up almost sitting on the floor, legs sprawled in front of her, head lolling against the wall. Blood pooled around her. He said, "Think fast, think fast." He knelt over her, one knee to either side, took her face in his hands, then closed his eyes. He brought her head forward, then slammed it back against the wall. 5 times. Then he held his fingers near her nostrils, without opening his eyes. He felt no exhalation. He backed away from her, turned away and opened his eyes, then walked around the flat, wiping things he might have touched with his handkerchief, avoiding looking at her. He was crying and shaking, but he couldn't think why. There was blood on his hands, his shirt, his trousers, his shoes. He found a garbage bag, put all his clothes in it, then washed the blood from his skin. There was a black spot in the center of his vision, but he worked around it. He put the garbage bag in his suitcase and put on fresh clothes, blue jeans and a black t-shirt. He went through the flat, packing away everything that belonged to him. He almost took Anna's address book, but when he checked, he saw that he wasn't in it. He looked for diaries, but found none. Dozens of people had seen them together, month after month. Anna's neighbors, Anna's friends. Dozens of people had seen them leave the nightclub. He wasn't sure how many of her friends knew what he did, where he was from. He'd never told any of them more than his first name. He'd always lied about the rest. But Anna might have told them everything she knew. Having been seen with her alive was bad enough. He couldn't risk being seen walking out the front door the night she was killed. The flat was 2 flights up. The bathroom window opened onto an alley. Thomas threw the suitcase down. It landed with a soft thud. He thought of jumping. almost believing that he could land unhurt, or almost believing that he wouldn't care. But there was a gray clarity underneath those delusions, and an engine in his skull 1 billion years old which only wanted to survive. He climbed up into the window frame, into the gap left by the sliding half pane, 1 foot either side of the track. There was no ledge, as such, just the double brickwork of the wall itself. He had to crouch to fit, and he found he could keep his balance by pushing his left hand up against the top of the frame, jamming himself in place. He turned sideways, then reached across the outside wall and into the frame of the bathroom window of the neighboring flat. He could hear traffic and music somewhere, but no lights showed from within the flat, and the alley below was deserted. The two windows were scarcely a meter apart, but the second one was closed, halving its width. With one hand on each edge, he shifted his right foot to the neighbor's window. Then, gripping the intervening wall tightly between his forearms, he moved his left foot across. Finally, securing himself by pressing up with his right hand, he let go of the first frame completely. He shuffled across one brick's width ledge, fighting an impulse to mutter Ave Marias. Pray for us sinners. He realized that he'd stopped weeping. A drain pipe ran close to the far side of the window. He imagined tearing his palms open on jagged, rusty metal, but the pipe was smooth. It took all his strength to hold himself in place, gripping it with hands and knees. When he touched the ground with his feet, his legs gave way. But not for long. He hid in a public toilet for 3 hours, staring up at one corner of the room. The lights, the tiles, could have belonged to a prison or an asylum. He found himself disconnected from the world, the past, his time breaking up into moments, shocks of awareness, shimmering droplets of mercury, beads of sweat. This isn't me. This is something else that believes it's me. And it's wrong, wrong, wrong. Nobody disturbed him. At 6 o'clock he walked out into the morning light and caught a train home. Happy New Year to you too, Nicole Berlino. Thanks for tuning in. Sorry you got to tune in for the part where a extremely wealthy son of a banker killed somebody and totally got away with it for his entire life. Chapter 15. Remit Not Paucity. April 2051. Durham's North Sydney flat was small and very sparsely furnished, not at all what Maria had expected. The combined living room and kitchen was all she'd seen, but it was clear from the outside that there wasn't space for much more. Durham was on the 16th floor, but the building was hemmed in on all sides by ugly late-20s office towers, blue and pink ersatz marble monstrosities. No expensive harbor views here. For someone who was ripping off gullible millionaires, or even someone who merely sold them insurance, Durham didn't seem to have much to show for it. Maria thought it unlikely that the place had been set up entirely for her benefit, to fit the story he'd told her, to demonstrate the frugal lifestyle which supposedly enabled him to pay her out of his own pocket. He'd invited her out of the blue. She would never have had a reason to insist on seeing where he lived. She put her notepad down on the scratched dining table and turned it so that Durham could read the graphs. These are the latest results for the two most promising species. A. lithophila has the higher mutation rate per generation, but it reproduces much more slowly and is more vulnerable to climate change. A. hydrophila is more prolific, with a stabler genome. It's not intrinsically hardier, it's just better protected by the ocean. Durham said, "What's your gut feeling?" "What's yours?" A. litho evolves into a few promising species, which all get wiped out by one major crisis. A. hydro slowly builds up a huge stock of survival-neutral mutations, some of which turn out to be useful on land. The first few 100,000 species which blow out of the sea don't make it, but it doesn't matter, there are always more. Or am I just being swayed too much by terrestrial preconceptions?
The people you are trying to convince will almost certainly think the same way." Durham laughed. "It wouldn't hurt to be right as well as persuasive, if they're not mutually exclusive ambitions." Maria didn't reply. She stared down at the notepad. She couldn't look Durham in the eye. Talking to him by phone, with software filters, had been bearable, and the work itself had been an end in itself. Immersed in the elaborate game of autoverse biochemistry, she found it all too easy to carry on, as if it made no difference what it was for. But she'd done next to nothing to make Durham more likely to take her into his confidence. That was why she'd agreed to this meeting, and why she had to take advantage of it. The trouble was, now that she was here, she was so ill at ease that she could barely discuss the most neutral technicalities without her voice faltering. If he started spouting lies about his hopes of debating the skeptics of the artificial life mafia in some future issue of Cellular Automaton World, she'd probably start screaming. Or, more likely, throw up on the bare linoleum floor. He said, "By the way, I signed the release on your fee this morning. I've authorized the trust fund to pay you in full. The work's been going so well, it seemed only fair." Maria glanced up at him, startled. He looked perfectly sincere, but she couldn't help wondering, not for the first time, if he knew that she'd been approached by Hayden, knew exactly what she'd been told. She felt her cheeks flush. She'd spent too many years using phones and filters. She couldn't keep anything from showing on her face. She said, "Thank you, but aren't you afraid I might take the first plane to the Bahamas? There's still a lot of work to be done."
"I think I can trust you."
There wasn't a trace of irony in his voice, but there really didn't need to be.
He said, "Speaking of trust, I think your phone may be bugged. I'm sorry. I should have told you that sooner."
Oh no. Maria stared at him. "How did you know?"
"No? You mean it is? You've had definite signs?"
"I'm not sure, but how?"
"Mine is. Bugged. So it makes sense that yours would be too."
Maria was bewildered. What was he going to do? Announce that the fraud squad were watching him? Yes, what was he going to do? What was he going to do? Announce that the fraud squad were watching him? If he came right out and said it, she didn't think she could dissemble any longer. She'd have to confess that she already knew, and then she'd have to tell him everything Hayden had said. Taking the pressure off completely, ending the farce for good. She had no talent for these stupid games. The sooner they could both stop lying to each other, the better. She said, "And who exactly do you think is doing it?" Durham paused to think it over, as if he hadn't seriously considered the question before.
Some corporate espionage unit? Some national security organization? There's really no way of telling. I know very little about the intelligence community. Your guess would be as good as mine."
"Then why do you think they're—"
Durham said blithely, "If I was developing a computer, say 30 orders of magnitude more powerful than any processor cluster in existence, don't you think people like that might take an interest?"
Maria almost choked. "Ah, yes."
"But of course I'm not, and eventually they'll convince themselves of that and leave us both alone. So there's absolutely nothing to worry about."
"Right."
Durham grinned at her. "Presumably they think that just because I've commissioned an autoverse planet, there's a chance I might possess the means to actually run it. They've searched this place a couple of times. I don't know what they expected to find. A little black box sitting in a corner of one of the rooms, hidden under a pot plant, quietly cracking military codes, raking in a fortune on the stock market, and simulating a universe or two on the side, just to keep from getting bored. Any 5-year-old could tell them how ludicrous that is. Maybe they think I've found a way to shrink individual processes to the size of an atom. That would just about do it."
So much for an end to the lying. He wasn't going to make this easy for her. All right. Maria forced the words out evenly, and any 5-year-old could tell you that if anyone searched your flat, it was the fraud squad. Durham was still giving nothing away.
"Why do you say that?"
"Because I know they're watching you. They've spoken to me. They've told me exactly what you're doing. Maria faced him squarely now. She was tense at the prospect of a confrontation, but she had nothing to be ashamed of. He was the one who'd set out to deceive her from the start. He said, "Don't you think the fraud squad would need to get a warrant and search the flat in my presence?" "Then maybe it hasn't been searched at all. That's not the point." He nodded slightly, as if conceding some minor breach of etiquette. "No, it's not. You want to know why I lied to you." Maria said, "I know why. Please don't treat me like an idiot." Her bitterness surprised her. She'd had to conceal it for so long. "I was hardly going to agree to be your accomplice." Durham raised one hand from the tabletop, a half conciliatory, half impatient gesture. Maria fell silent, more from astonishment at how calmly he seemed to be taking all this than any desire to give him a chance to defend himself. He said, "I lied because I didn't know if you'd believe the truth or not. I think you might have, but I couldn't be sure, and I couldn't risk it. I'm sorry." "Of course I would have believed the truth. It would have made a lot more sense than the bullshit you fed me. But yes, I can see why you couldn't risk it." Durham still showed no sign of contrition. "Do you know what it is that I'm offering my backers? The ones who've been funding your work? A sanctuary, a privately owned computer somewhere. That's almost true, depending on what you take those words to mean." Maria laughed cynically. "Oh, yes. Which words do you have trouble with? Privately owned?" "No. Computer. And somewhere." "Now you're just being childish." She reached out and picked up her notepad, slid her chair back, and rose to her feet. Trying to think of a parting shot, it struck her that the most frustrating thing was that the bastard had paid her. He'd lied to her, he'd made her an accomplice, but he hadn't actually swindled her. Durham looked up at her calmly. He said, "I've committed no crime. My backers know exactly what they're paying for. The fraud squad, like the intelligence agencies, are jumping to absurd conclusions. I've told them the whole truth. They've chosen not to believe me." Maria stood by the table, one hand on the back of the chair. "They said you refused to discuss the matter." "Well, that's a lie, although what I had to say certainly wasn't what they wanted to hear." "What did you have to say?" Durham gave her a searching look. "If I try to explain, will you listen? Will you sit down and listen to the end?" "I might." "Because if you don't want to hear the whole story, you might as well leave right now. Not every copy took me up on the offer, but the only ones who went to the police were the ones who refused to hear me out." Maria said, exasperated, "What do you care what I think now? You've extracted all the Autoverse technobabble from me you could possibly need. And I know nothing more about your scam than the police do. They'll have no reason to ask me to testify against you, if all I can say in court is, 'Detective Hayden told me this, Detective Hayden told me that.' So why don't you quit while you're ahead?" Durham said simply, "Because you don't understand anything, and I owe you an explanation." Maria looked toward the door, but she didn't take her hand off the back of the chair. The work had been an end in itself, but she was still curious to know precisely what Durham had intended to do with the fruits of her labor. She said, "How was I going to spend the afternoon anyway? Modeling the survival of Autobacterium hydrophila in sea spray?" She said, "Go ahead. I'm listening." She sat. "Go ahead. I'm listening." Durham said, "Almost 6 years ago, loosely speaking, a man I know made a copy of himself. When the copy woke up, it panicked and tried to bail out. The original had sabotaged the software. Bailing out was impossible." "That's illegal." "I know." "So who was this man?" "His name was Paul Durham." "You? You were the original?" "Oh, no. I was the copy." Dramatic twist? Dun, dun, dun. Now, how does that work? Stay a while and listen. You may just find out.
Chapter 16.
Toy Man, Picture It. June 2045. We're at about the halfway point, so I think it's safe to tell you. So every single one of those subtitles for the chapters is an anagram. What is it an anagram of, you ask? Well, that's where things get interesting. It's Permutation City. It's an anagram of Permutation City, every single one of them, and each of them is delightfully appropriate in some way as well. Um, remit, not paucity. Um, what's the Rip Tie Cut Toy Man? Uh, is Rip Tie Cut Toy Man is generally taking place when it's Paul Durham being experimented on, the copy of Paul Durham. Remit not paucity is the plot timeline, basically the main present day in quotes plot timeline. Uh, and then Toy Man Picture It is kind of how the tables have changed for our Paul Durham copy, or it's a different Paul Durham copy. Take your pick, since it's not easy to know which one is which. And I think the last time we saw the Paul Durham copy, uh, he was shut down because Elizabeth raised some pretty good ethical quandaries, which is reasonable. Elizabeth being biological meat space, Paul Durham, his wife. Anyway, Chapter 16, Toy Man, Picture It. June 2045. Paul felt a hand gripping his forearm. He tried to shake it off, but his arm barely moved, and a terrible aching started up in his shoulder. He opened his eyes, then closed them again in pain. He tried again. On the fifth or sixth attempt, he managed to see a face through the washed-out brightness and tears. Elizabeth. She raised a cup to his lips. He took a sip, spluttered and choked, but then managed to force some of the thin, sweet liquid down. She said, "You're going to be fine. Just take it easy." "Why are you here?" He coughed, shook his head, wished he hadn't. He was touched, but confused. Why had his original lied, claiming that she wanted to shut him down, when in fact she was sympathetic enough to go through the arduous process of visiting him? He was lying on something like a dentist's couch, in an unfamiliar room. He was in a hospital gown. There was a drip in his right arm, and a catheter in his urethra. He glanced up to see an interface helmet, a bulky hemisphere of magnetic axon current inducers, suspended from a gantry, not far above his head. He thought, fair enough, to construct a simulated meeting place that looked like the room that her real body must be in. That her real body must be in. Putting him in the couch, though, and giving him all the symptoms of a waking visitor, seemed a little extreme. He tapped the couch with his left hand. "What's the message? You want me to know exactly why you're going through? Oh, sorry. What's the message? You want me to know exactly what you're going through? Okay, I'm grateful, and it's good to see you." He shuddered with relief and delayed shock. "Fantastic, to tell you the truth." He laughed weakly. "I honestly believed he was going to wipe me out. The man's a complete lunatic. Believe me, you're talking to his better half." Elizabeth was perched on a stool beside him. She said, "Paul, try to listen carefully to what I'm going to say. You'll start to reintegrate the memories gradually, on your own, but it'll help if I talk you through it all first. To start with, you're not a copy. You're flesh and blood." Paul coughed, tasting acid. Durham had let her do something unspeakable to the model of his digestive system. "I'm flesh and blood? What kind of sadistic joke is that? Do you have any idea how hard it's been, coming to terms with the truth?" She said, patiently, "It's not a joke. I know you don't remember yet, but after you've made that scan that was going to run as a copy number 5." After you made the scan that was going to run as copy number 5, you finally told me what you were doing, and I persuaded you not to run it until you'd tried another experiment, putting yourself in its place, finding out firsthand what it would be forced to go through. What it would be forced to go through. I'm losing my diction. And you agreed. You entered the virtual environment which the copy would have inhabited, with your memories since the day of the scan suppressed, so you had no way of knowing that you were only a visitor. I... I... You're not the copy. Do you understand? All you've been doing is visiting the environment you'd prepared for copy number 5. And now you're out of it. You're back in the real world. Her face betrayed no hint of deception, but software could smooth that out. He said, I don't believe you. How can I be the original? I spoke to the original. What am I supposed to believe? He was the copy, thinking he was an original? He was the original? Of course not. That would hardly have spared the copy, would it? The 5th scan was never run. I controlled the puppet that played your original. Software provided the vocabulary signature and body language, but I pulled the strings. You briefed me beforehand on what to have it say and do. You'll remember that soon enough. But the experiments. The experiments were a sham. They could hardly have been performed on a visitor, on a physical brain, could they? Paul shook his head and whispered, Abulafia. No interface window appeared. That's his digital safe word, as it were. He gripped the couch and closed his eyes, then laughed. You say I agreed to this? What kind of masochist would do that? I'm going out of my mind. I don't know what I am. Elizabeth took hold of his arm again. You're disoriented, but that won't last long. And you know why you agreed. You were sick of copies bailing out on you. You had to come to terms with their experience. Spending a few days believing you were a copy would make or break the project. You'd either end up psychologically prepared, at last, to give rise to a copy who'd be able to cope with its fate, or you'd gain enough sympathy for their plight to stop creating them. The plan was to tell you everything while you were still inside, after the 3rd experiment. But when you went weird on me in there, I panicked. All I could think of was having the puppet playing your original tell you that it was going to pause you. I'm going to reread that sentence. All I could think of was having the puppet playing your original tell you that it was going to pause you. I wasn't trying to frighten you. I didn't think you'd take it so badly. A technician came into the room and removed the drip and catheter. Paul propped himself up and looked out through the windows of the room's swing doors. He could see half a dozen people in the corridor. He bellowed wordlessly at the top of his lungs. They all turned to stare in his direction. The technician said mildly, Your penis might sting for an hour or two. Paul slumped back onto the couch and turned to Elizabeth. You wouldn't pay for reactive crowds. I wouldn't pay for reactive crowds. It looks like you're telling the truth. People. Glorious people. Thousands of strangers meeting his eyes with suspicion or puzzlement, stepping out of his way on the street. Or, more often, clearly, consciously refusing to. Or, more often, clearly, consciously refusing to. There we go. The freedom of the city was so sweet. He walked the streets of Sydney for a full day, rediscovering every ugly shopping arcade, every piss-stinking, litter-strewn park and alley, until, with aching feet, he squeezed his way home through the evening rush hour to watch the real-time news. There was no room for doubt. He was not in a virtual environment. Nobody in the world could have had reason to spend so much money simply to deceive him. When Elizabeth asked if his memories were back, he nodded and said, Of course. She didn't grill him on the details. In fact, having gone over her story so many times in his head, he could almost imagine the stages. his qualms after the fifth scan, repeatedly putting off running the model, confessing to Elizabeth about the project, accepting her challenge to experience for himself just what his copies were suffering. And if the suppressed memories hadn't actually reintegrated, well, he'd checked the literature, and there was a 2.5% risk of that happening. Electronically censoring access to memories could sometimes permanently weaken the neural connections in which they were encoded. He even had an account from the database service which showed that he'd consulted the very same articles before. He reread and replayed the news reports that he'd accessed from inside, and found no discrepancies. He flicked through encyclopedic databases, spot-checking random facts of history, geography, astronomy, and although he was surprised now and then by details which he'd never come across before, there were no startling contradictions. The continents hadn't moved. Stars and planets hadn't vanished. The same wars had been lost and won. Everything was consistent. Everything was explicable. And yet he couldn't stop wondering about the fate of a copy who was shut down and never run again. A normal human death was one thing. Woven into a much vaster tapestry, it was a process which made perfect sense. From the internal point of view of a copy whose model was simply halted, though, there was no explanation whatsoever for its demise, just an edge where the pattern abruptly came to an end. But if the insight he'd gained from the experiments was true, whether or not they'd really ever really happened, if a copy could assemble itself from dust scattered across the world, and bridge the gaps in its existence with dust from across the universe, then why should it ever come to an inconsistent end? Why shouldn't the pattern keep on finding itself? Or find a larger pattern into which it could merge? The dust theory implied a countless number of alternative worlds, billions of different possible histories spelled out from the same primordial alphabet soup. One history in which Durham did run copy number 5, and one in which he didn't, but was persuaded to take its place as a visitor instead. But if a visitor had been perfectly deceived and had experienced everything the copy did, what set the two of them apart? So long as the flesh and blood man had no way of knowing the truth, it was meaningless to talk about two different people in two different worlds. The two patterns of thought and perceptions had effectively merged into one. If the copy had been allowed to keep on running after the visitor had learned that he was flesh and blood, their two paths would have diverged again. But the copy had been shut down. It had no future at all in its original world, no separate life to live. So the two subjective histories remained as one. Paul had been a visitor believing he was a copy. And he'd also been the copy itself. The patterns had merged seamlessly. There could be no way of saying that one history was true and the other false. Both explanations were equally valid. Once, preparing to be scanned, he'd had two futures. Now, he had two pasts. Paul woke in darkness, confused for a moment, then pulled his cramped left arm out from under the pillow and glanced at his watch. Low-power infrared sensors in the watch face detected his gaze, and flashed up the time, followed by a reminder. Due at Landau, 7 a.m. It was barely after 5, but it hardly seemed worth going back to sleep. Memories of the night before came back to him. Elizabeth had finally confronted him, asking what decision he'd reached, to abandon his life's work or to forge ahead now that he knew firsthand what was involved. His answer seemed to have disappointed her. He didn't expect to see her again. How could he give up? He knew he could never be sure that he'd discovered the truth, but that didn't mean that nobody else could. If he made a copy, ran it for a few virtual days, then terminated it abruptly, then at least that copy would know if its own pattern of experience continued. And if another Paul Durham in one of the countless billions of alternative worlds could provide a future for the terminated copy, a pattern into which it could emerge, then perhaps that flesh and blood Durham would repeat the whole process again. And so on, again and again. And although the seams would always be perfect, the explanation for the flesh and blood human believing that he had a second past as a copy would necessarily grow ever more contrived, less convincing, and the dust theory would become ever more compelling. Paul lay in bed in the darkness, waiting for sunrise, staring into the future down this corridor of mirrors. Mirrors. One thing nagged at him. He could have sworn he'd had a dream just before he woke. An elaborate fable conveying some kind of insight. That's all he knew, or thought he knew. The details hovered maddeningly on the verge of recollection. His dreams were evanescent, though, and he didn't expect to remember anything more. Chapter 17. Remit Not Paucity. April 2051. Maria shifted in her seat to try to get her circulation flowing, then realized it wasn't enough. She stood up and limped around the room, bending down to massage her cramped right calf. She said, "And you claim you're the 23rd?" She was almost afraid to sound too skeptical, not because she believed that Durham would take offense, but because the story was so strangely entrancing that she wasn't sure she wanted to deflate it yet. One hint of mockery and the floodgates would open. "You're the 23rd flesh and blood Paul Durham whose past includes all those who came before?" Durham said, "I may be wrong about the exact number. I may have counted this last version more than once. If I'm capable of believing in 23 incarnations, some of them might be false. The whole nature of the delusions I suffered contributes to the uncertainty." "Contributes? Isn't that a bit of an understatement?" Durham was unflappable. "I'm cured now. The nanosurgery worked. The doctors pronounced me sane, and I have no reason to question their judgment. They've scanned my brain. It's functioning impeccably. I've seen the data before and after. Activity in the prefrontal cortex. But don't you see how absurd that is? You acknowledge that you were deluded. You insist that you're cured now. But you claim that your delusions weren't delusions." Durham said patiently, "I've admitted from the outset, my condition explains everything. I believed, because I was mentally ill, that I was the 23rd generation copy of another Paul Durham from another world." Because you were mentally ill. End of story." "No, because I'm certifiably rational now, and the logic of the dust theory makes as much sense to me as ever, and it makes no difference whether my memories are true, false, or both." Maria groaned. "Logic of the dust theory! It's not a theory! It can't be tested!" "Can't be tested by whom?" "By anyone! I mean, even assuming that everything you believe is the truth, you've been through 23 separate experiments, and you still don't know what you've proved or disproved. As you say, your condition accounts for everything. Haven't you heard of Occam's razor? Once you have a perfectly simple explanation for something, you don't go looking for ever more complicated ways of explaining the very same thing. No dust theory is required." Her words reverberated in the near empty room. She said, "I need some fresh air." Durham said firmly, "After 23 ambiguous results, I know how to get it right this time. A copy plus a virtual environment is a patchwork, a mess. A mess. A system like that isn't rich enough, detailed enough, or consistent enough to be self-sustaining. If it was, then when I was shut down, the entire Okay, let's try this again. If it was, when I was shut down, the entire VR world I was in would have persisted. That never happened. Instead, every time, I found a flesh and blood human with a reason to believe he shared my past. That explained my pattern of experience far better than VR, even to the point of insanity. What I have to do now is construct a consistent pattern which can only have one past. Maria took a few deep breaths. It was almost too much to bear. Durham's sad flat, his cosmic visions, his relentless, mechanical logic, grinding away, trying to make sense of the legacy of his disease. The doctors had cured him. He was sane. He just didn't want to disown his delusional past. So he'd invented a flawlessly logical, utterly irrefutable reason to hang on to it. If he'd really told the cops all this, why were they still hounding him? They should have seen that he was harmless and left him alone, and left his moronic clients to fend for themselves. The man wasn't even a danger to himself. And if he could ever harness a fraction of the energy and intelligence he'd put into this project and direct it towards something worthwhile. Durham said, "Do you know what a Garden of Eden configuration is?" Maria was caught blank for a second. Then she said, "Yes, of course. In cellular automaton theory, it's a state of the system that can't be the result of any previous state. No other pattern of cells can give rise to it. If you want a Garden of Eden configuration, you have to start with it. You have to put it in by hand as the system's first state." Durham grinned at her as if she'd conceded the whole argument. She said, "What?" "Isn't it obvious? A cellular automaton isn't like patchwork VR. It's every bit as consistent as a physical universe. There's no jumble of ad hoc high-level laws. One set of rules applies to every cell, right?" "Yes, but—" "So if I set up a cellular automaton in a Garden of Eden configuration, run it through a few trillion clock ticks, then shut it down, the pattern will continue to find itself in the dust, separate from this version of me, separate from this world, but still flowing unambiguously from that initial state. A state which can't be explained by the rules of the automaton. A state which must have been constructed in another world, exactly as I remember it. The whole problem so far has been that my memories are always entirely explicable within the new world. I shut myself down as a copy, and find myself in a flesh and blood body with flesh and blood memories which the laws of physics could have produced from earlier states of a flesh and blood brain. I lost my place. How did I do this? This world can explain me. Only as a man This world can explain me, only as a man whose delusions are unlikely beyond belief, but there's no denying that I do have a complete extra history here that's not literally, physically impossible. So whatever I prefer to believe, I have to concede that the outcome of the experiment is still ambiguous. I could still be wrong. But a cellular automaton can't provide an extra history for a Garden of Eden configuration. It's mathematically impossible. If I find myself inside a cellular automaton universe, and I can track my past back to a Garden of Eden configuration, that will be conclusive proof that I did seed the whole universe in a previous incarnation. The dust theory will be vindicated, and I'll finally know, beyond any doubt, that I haven't merely been insane all along. Maria felt punch drunk. At one level, she knew she should stop humoring him, stop treating his ideas seriously. On another, it seemed that if Durham was so wrong, she should be able to point out the reasons why. She shouldn't have to call him a madman and refuse to listen to another word. She said, "Find yourself in a cellular automaton world? You don't mean the autoverse?" "Of course not. There's no prospect of translating a human into autoverse biochemistry." "Then what?" "There's a cellular automaton called TVC, after Turing, von Neumann, and Chang. Chang completed it around 2010. It's a souped-up, more elegant version of von Neumann's work from the 1950s. Maria nodded uncertainly. She'd heard of all this, but it wasn't her field. She did know that John von Neumann and his students had developed a two-dimensional cellular automaton, a simple universe in which you could embed an elaborate pattern of cells, a rather Lego-like machine, which acted as both a universal constructor and a universal computer. Given the right program, a string of cells to be interpreted as coded instructions rather than part of the machine, it could carry out any computation and build anything at all. I'm not actually sure if it's pronounced Newman or Neumann. I've heard both. I think my gut has always said von Neumann, but it might be Neumann. Anyway, given the right program, a string of cells to be interpreted as coded instructions rather than part of the machine, it could carry out any computation and build anything at all, including another copy of itself, which could build another copy, and so on. Little self-replicating toy computers could blossom into existence without end. She said, Chang's version was three-dimensional, wasn't it? Much better. N-dimensional. 4, 5, 6, whatever you like. That leaves plenty of room for data within easy reach. In 2 dimensions, the original von Neumann machine had to reach further and further, and wait longer and longer for each successive bit of data. In a 6-dimensional TVC automaton, you can have a 3-dimensional grid of computers which keeps on growing indefinitely, each with its own 3-dimensional memory, which can also grow without bound. Maria said numbly, Where are you supposed to fit into all of this? Where are you supposed to fit into all of this? If you think translating human biochemistry into autoverse terms is difficult, how are you going to map yourself into a 6-dimensional world designed solely to support von Neumann machines? The TVC universe is one big, ever-expanding processor cluster. It runs a copy of me. I thought the whole point was to do away with the copies. In a VR environment which lets me interact with the TVC level. Yes, I'll be a patchwork copy, as always. There's no alternative to that. But I'll also be linked to the cellular automaton itself. I'll witness its operation. I'll experience its laws. By observing it, I'll make it a part of what has to be explained. And when the simulated TVC universe being run on the physical computer is suddenly shut down, the best explanation for what I've witnessed will be a continuation of that universe, an extension made out of dust. This is getting pretty solipsistic. Maria could almost see it. A vast lattice of computers, a seed of order in a sea of random noise. A seed of order in a sea of random noise, extending itself from moment to moment by sheer force of internal logic, accreting the necessary building blocks from the chaos of non-space-time by the very act of defining space and time. Visualizing wasn't believing, though. She said, What makes you so sure? Why not another deluded psychiatric patient who believes he was, briefly, a copy being run on a TVC automaton being run on a processor cluster in another world? You're the one who invoked Occam's razor. Wouldn't you say that a self-contained TVC universe is a simpler explanation by far? No, it's about the most bizarre thing I can imagine. It's a lot less bizarre than yet another version of this universe, containing yet another version of me, with yet another set of convenient delusions. How many of your clients believed in all this? How many think they're coming along for the ride? 15, and there's a 16th who, I think, is tempted. They paid 2 million each. About 2 million each, he snorted. It's quite funny, the significance the police have attached to that. Some large sums of money have changed hands for reasons more complex than usual, so they assume I must be doing something illegal. I mean, billionaires have been known to make donations larger than that to the Church of the God who makes no difference. He added hastily, None of mine. Maria was having some trouble with the scale of things herself. You found 15 copies willing to part with $2 million after hearing this bullshit? Anyone that gullible deserves to lose their money. Durham took no offense. "If you were a copy, you'd believe the dust theory, too. You'd feel the truth of it in your non-existent bones. Some of these people carried out the same experiments as I did, computing themselves in randomized fragments, but others didn't need to. They already knew that they could scatter themselves across real time and real space, and they'd still find themselves. Every copy proves the dust theory to itself 1,000,000 times a day." It suddenly occurred to Maria that Durham might have invented all of this for her sake alone, while telling his clients exactly what Hayden had assumed, some fraudulent but utterly non-metaphysical tale of a hidden supercomputer. But she couldn't see what he had to gain by confusing her, and too many details made too much sense now. If his clients had accepted the whole mad vision, the problem of making them believe in a non-existent supercomputer vanished. Or, at least, changed from question of evidence to a question of faith. She said, "So you promised to fit a snapshot of each of your backers into the Garden of Eden configuration, plus the software to run them on the TVC?" Durham said proudly, "All that and more. The major world libraries, not quite the full holdings, but tens of millions of files, text, audio, visual, interactive, on every conceivable subject. Databases too numerous to list, including all the mapped genomes. Software, expert systems, knowledge miners, metaprogrammers. Thousands of off-the-shelf VR environments, deserts, jungles, coral reefs, Mars and the Moon. And I've commissioned Malcolm Carter, no less, to create a major city to act as a central meeting place. Permutation City, capital of the TVC universe. And of course, there'll be your contribution, the seed for an alien world. Humanity is going to find other life in this universe eventually. How can we give up hope of doing the same? Sure, we'll have our own software descendants, and recreated Earth animals, no doubt novel, wholly artificial creatures as well. We won't be alone, but we still need a chance to confront the other. We mustn't leave that possibility behind. And what could be more alien than Autoverse life?" Maria's skin crawled. Durham's logic was impeccable. An endlessly expanding TVC universe, with new computing power being manufactured out of nothing in all directions, would eventually be big enough to run an Autoverse planet, or even a whole planetary system. The packed version of Planet Lambert, the compressed description with its topographic summaries in place of actual mountains and rivers, would easily fit into the memory of a real-world computer. Then Durham's copy could simply wait for the TVC grid to be big enough, or pause himself to avoid waiting, and have the whole thing unfold. Durham said, "I've been working on the software which will run the first moments of the TVC universe on a real-world computer. I could probably finish that myself, but I can't complete the Autoverse work without you, Maria." She laughed sharply. "You want me to keep working for you? You lie to me. You get me visited by the fraud squad. You confess to a history of mental illness. You tell me you're the 23rd incarnation of a retailing millionaire from a parallel world. Whatever you think about the dust theory, and whatever you think about my psychological health, I can prove to you that I'm not a criminal. My backers will vouch for that. They all know exactly what their money's being used for. None of them are victims of fraud." "I accept that. I just—" "Then accept the payment. Finish the work. Whatever the police have told you, you have every right to the money, and I have every right to give it to you. Nobody's going to take you to court. Nobody's going to throw you into prison." Maria was flustered. Just hold on. Will you give me a chance to think?" Durham's sheer reasonableness was beginning to be as exhausting as the impassioned rhetoric of any obvious fanatic, and so much ground had shifted in the last half hour that she hadn't had a chance to even start to reappraise her own situation, legally, financially, and morally. She said, "Why don't your backers tell the police all this? If they can confirm your story for me, why can't they do the same for the cops? By refusing to talk, they're just fueling suspicion." Durham agreed. "Tell me about it. It makes everything 10 times harder, but I'm just going to have to keep on living with that. Do you think they'd risk the truth becoming public knowledge? There have already been some embarrassing leaks, but so far we've been able to muddy the water by putting out our own misinformation. Copies with de facto control of billion-dollar business empires would much rather have people linking them to some dubious salesman and his breakthrough supercomputer, and have the rumors fizzle out from lack of substantiation, than let the world know that they plan to send a clone into an artificial universe which runs without hardware. The share markets can get nervous enough when people start wondering if a certain board of directors have all taken up playing virtual Caligula in their spare time. If word got out that a copy in a position of power had done something which might be construed as a sign that they no longer felt obliged to give a shit about their corporate responsibilities, their personal wealth, or the continued existence of planet Earth. Gasp, that's a long heckin' sentence. Suffice it to say, he has a point. Uh, this dust theory thing is, as Maria said, it's unverifiable. Like you can't verify it. Like even his plan, her argument against that is like, couldn't it just be another simulation of you simulating yourself at that point? How does this help? He's like, but it will prove it. It's like, I mean, once you've gone out that far, are you really willing to say, no, that's far enough? Because I mean, you might as well keep going. Anyway, Maria walked over to the window. It was open, but the air outside was still. Standing by the insect screen, she might as well have been standing by a solid brick wall. People were arguing loudly in the flat above. She'd only just noticed. When Durham had first approached her, she'd wondered, half seriously, if she'd be taking advantage of a man who'd taken leave of his senses. Now, she couldn't just shrug that off as a hypocritical insult to a fellow eccentric. This wasn't a matter of an artificial life fanatic with more money than sense. An ex-psychiatric patient was planning to spend $30 million of other people's money to prove his own sanity, and lead the clones of his followers into a cybernetic paradise which would last for about 20 seconds. Taking a cut seemed just a tiny bit like doing the catering for the Jonestown massacre. Just a bit. There's some ethical dilemmas. Durham said, "If you don't agree to finish the biosphere seed, who would I get to replace you? There's nobody else who could even begin to grasp what's involved." Maria eyed him sharply. "Don't start flattering me. And don't kid yourself about the seed either. You asked for a package of persuasive data, and that's all you're getting, even if I finish the work. If you're counting on Planet Lambert's inhabitants rising up on their hind legs and talking to you, I can't guarantee that happening if you ran the whole thing a billion times. You should have simulated real-world biochemistry. At least it's been shown that intelligent life can arise within that system, and you'd supposedly have the computing power to do it." Durham said reasonably, "A Lamberti seemed simpler, surer. Any real-world organism, modeled subatomically, would be too big a program to test out in advance on any physical computer, and it'd be too late to change my mind and try another approach if I failed to get it to work. Stuck in the TVC universe with plenty of books and journals, but no pool of expertise." Maria felt a deep chill pass through her. Every time she thought she'd accepted just how seriously Durham took this lunacy, he gave an answer like that which drove it home to her anew. She said, "Well, the Autoverse life might turn out to be just as useless. You might have A. hydrophila spewing out useless mutations, generation after generation, with nothing you can do to fix it." Durham seemed about to reply, but then stopped himself. Maria felt the chill return, at first without knowing why. A second later she glared at him, outraged, as furious as if he'd come right out and asked her, "I will not be there to fix it for you." Durham had the grace to look cowed, momentarily, but instead of denying that the thought had ever crossed his mind, he said, "If you don't believe in the dust theory, what difference would it make if there's a scan file of you in the Garden of Eden data? I don't want a copy of me waking up and living for a few subjective seconds, knowing that it's about to die." Who said anything about waking it? Running a copy on a simulated TVC grid is a computer-intensive operation. We can't afford to wake more than one copy while we're still running on a physical computer. Mine. As far as you're concerned, your scan file would never even be used to build a copy. The data would just sit there, completely inert. And you could sit outside at a terminal, overseeing the whole operation, making sure I kept my word. Maria was scandalized, although it took her a second to weave through Durham's infuriating logic to find a target. And you, certain that I'd eventually wake, would happily take me on board under false pretenses? Durham seemed genuinely baffled by the accusation. False pretenses? I've given you all the facts, and I've argued my case as hard as I can. It's not my fault if you don't believe me. Am I supposed to feel guilty for being right? Maria started to reply, but then the point seemed too ridiculous to pursue. She said, "Never mind. You won't get a chance to feel anything about it because I'm certainly not offering you a scan file." Durham bowed his head. "It's your decision." Maria hugged herself. She was actually trembling slightly. She thought, "I'm afraid of exploiting him? If what he's doing really is legitimate, finish the job. Take the money. His copy's going to spend a few seconds believing it's headed for copy heaven, and that's going to happen whatever I do. The 15 clones will just sleep through it all as if they'd never been made. That's no Jonestown." Durham said, "The fee would be $600,000. Maria said, "I don't care if it's 600 million." She'd meant to shout, but her words faded out into a whisper. "I don't care if it's 600 million." $600,000 would be enough to save Francesca's life. Chapter 18. Remit Not Paucity. May 2051. Pierre seemed to be making love with Kate, but he had his doubts. He lay on the soft dry grass of a boundless meadow, in mild sunshine. Kate's hair was longer than usual, tickling his skin wherever she kissed him, brushing against him with an erotic precision which seemed unlikely to have been left to chance. Insect chirps and bird song were heard. Pierre could recall David Hawthorne screwing a long-suffering lover in a field once. They'd been driving back to London from her father's funeral in Yorkshire. It had seemed like a good idea at the time. This was different. No twigs, no stones, no animal shit. No damp earth, no grass stains, no itching. The perfect meadow itself was no reason for suspicion. Neither of them were verisimilitude freaks, masochistic recreators of the irritating details of real environments. Good sex was, equally, a matter of choice. But Pierre still found himself wondering if Kate really had agreed to the act. She hadn't actually made love to him for months, however many times he'd recycled the memories of the last occasion, and he couldn't rule out the possibility that he'd merely decided to fool himself into believing that she'd finally relented. He'd never gone quite so far before, so far as he presently knew, but he had a vague memory of resolving to do a thorough job of concealing the evidence, if he ever did. He could clearly remember Kate beginning to flirt as they toured Carter's City, and then reaching out and starting to undress him as they stood in the exit doorway. He'd shut down all limits on her access to his body while she'd been unbuttoning his shirt, and he'd bellowed with shock and delight when, in the middle of their physically plausible foreplay, an invisible second Kate, 20 times his size, had picked him up in one hand, raised him to her mouth, and licked his body from toes to forehead like a sweet-toothed giant taking the icing off of a man-shaped cake. None of this struck him as especially unlikely. If Kate had decided to make love again, it was the kind of thing he could imagine her doing. That, in itself, proved nothing. He could have scripted this fantasy to fit everything he knew about her, or chosen the scenario and then rewritten his knowledge of her to accommodate the action. In either case, software could have laid down a trail of false memories, a plausible transition from their meeting with Carter, which he felt certain had actually happened, to this moment. All memories of having planned the deception would have been temporarily suppressed. Kate stopped moving. She shook her head, spattering his face and chest with sweat, and said, "Are you here where you seem to be, or off somewhere else?"
I was about to ask you the same question.
She smiled wickedly.
Ah, then maybe this body you hope is me only asked you first to put your mind at ease.
In the sky above her right shoulder, Pierre could see a stray cloud taking on a new shape, a whimsical sculpture parodying the bodies on the grass below. He said, "And then admitted as much?" Kate nodded and started slowly rising.
Of course, for the very same reason. How many levels of bluffing will it take before you get bored and say, fuck it, I don't care?
She lifted herself until they were almost apart. He closed his eyes and violated the geometry, licking the sweat from between her shoulder blades without moving a muscle. She responded by sticking her tongue in both of his ears simultaneously. He laughed and opened his eyes. The cloud above had darkened. Kate lowered herself onto him again, trembling very slightly. She said,
Don't you find it ironic?
"What?"
Transhumans taking pleasure by stimulating copies of the neural pathways which used to be responsible for the continuation of the species. Out of all the possibilities, we cling to that.
Pierre said, "No, I don't find it ironic. I had my irony glands removed. It was either that or castration." She smiled down at him.
I love you, you know. But would I tell you that? Or would you be stupid enough to pretend that I had?
Warm, sweet rain began to fall. He said, "I don't care. I don't care. I don't care." Man, y'all are getting philosophical double whammies, or philosophical and metaphysical double whammies with Yukikaze and this. We haven't gotten to all the really metaphysical stuff with Yukikaze. Mostly that's going to be philosophical questions, um, but some metaphysics involved. Where were we? Pierre sat on the lowest of the 4 wooden steps leading up to the back porch of his homestead, glancing down now and then at his bare feet and thin brown arms. 10-year-old farm boy at dusk. Kate had made both the environment and the body for him, and he liked the tranquil mood of the piece. There was no invented family, no role to play. This was a painting, not a drama. One place, one moment, lasting as long as he chose to inhabit it. The scenery wasn't quite photorealist. There were subtle distortions of form, color, and texture which made it impossible to forget that he was inhabiting a work of art. But there were no sledgehammer techniques, no visible brush strokes, no Van Gogh lighting effects. Violating the whole aesthetic, an interface window hovered in front of him, a meter above the chicken feed scattered dirt. The cloning utility insisted on following an elaborate confirmation sequence. Pierre kept saying, "Please skip to the final question, I know exactly what I'm doing," but icons in legal wigs and gowns kept popping up in front of the window and declaring solemnly, "You must read this warning carefully. Your brain model will be directly examined for evidence of complete understanding before we proceed to the next stage." It was 1,000 times more troubling than bailing out. He knew that for certain, having almost done it. But then bailing out entailed fewer legal complications for the people outside. Pierre's estate was controlled by an executor who'd signed a contract obliging her to act according to, quote, any duly authenticated communications, including but not limited to visual and or auditory simulations of a human being appearing to proffer instructions or advice, unquote. What duly authenticated meant revolved around a 99-digit code key which had been hardwired into Pierre's model of a brain when his copy was generated from his scan file. So, yes. Thank you, Greg Egan, for making sure that your world logic is internally consistent. It's like, they're going to have they're going to need to have some way to identify themselves, right? Like a permanent technological identifier that proves I personal identifier that proves this is me. And basically they gave them a like an IMEI ID, a hardware ID, software ID, a unique user number. He could summon it up consciously if he had to, in some unlikely emergency, but normally he made use of it by a simple act of will. He'd record a video postcard, wish it to be duly authenticated, and it was done. Unless the key was stolen, plucked right out of the computer memory which contained the data representing his brain, Pierre was the only software on the planet capable of encrypting instructions to his executor in a form compatible with her own matching key. Not an IMEI. What are those called? One of those hashing things. My brain isn't working right now. You're just gonna have to live with it. I know what I'm talking about, but I can't express what I know that I'm talking about very well to make it clear that I know what I'm trying to say. So it's useless. We're getting into a, or am I just a voice you people are hearing in your heads? Because I might be the solipsistic hallucination that one of you is having. I wouldn't know. And you can't either. That's the best part. Even if you met me, you couldn't prove it. Depending on how far down that rabbit hole you're willing to put yourself. Anyway, where were we? Right. Capable of encrypting instructions to his executor in a form compatible with her own matching key, it was the closest thing he had to a legal identity. By law, any clone which a copy made of itself had to be given a new key. It was up to the initial copy, prior to the cloning, to divide up the worldly assets between the two future selves, or rather, divide them up between the executor's two portfolios. Pierre fought his way through the process of assuring the cloning utility that he really had meant what he'd told it from the start. The clone would require no assets of its own. Pierre would run it on sufferance, paying for its running time himself. He didn't plan on keeping it conscious for more than a minute or two, just long enough to reassure himself that he was doing the right thing. He almost wished that Kate was with him now. She'd offered to be here, but he'd turned her down. He would have been glad of her support, but this had to be done in private. Finally, the utility said,
"This is your last chance to cancel. Are you sure you wish to proceed?"
Alternatively, this is your last chance to cancel. Are you sure you wish to proceed?
Pierre closed his eyes. When I see my original sitting on the porch, I'll know who I am and accept it. He said, "Yes, I'm sure." Pierre felt no change. He opened his eyes. His newly made twin stood on the ground where the interface window had been, staring at him, wide-eyed. Pierre shivered. He recognized the boy as himself, and not just intellectually. Kate's piece included adjustments to every part of his brain which dealt with his body image, so he'd be no more shocked by catching a glimpse of himself in a mirror than he was by the way his limbs felt as he walked. But the effect wasn't so much to see through the disguise of the 10-year-old body as to find himself thinking of the clone and himself as if the two of them really were that young. How could he send this child into exile? Pierre brushed the absurd notion aside. "Well?" The clone seemed dazed. Pierre prompted him. "You know what I want to hear. Are you ready for this? Are you happy with your fate? Did I make the right decision? You're the only one who knows now." "But I don't know." He looked at Pierre pleadingly, as if hoping for guidance. "Why am I doing this? Remind me." Pierre was taken aback, but some disorientation was only to be expected. His own voice sounded normal to him, thanks to the neural adjustments, but the clone still sounded like a frightened child. He said gently, Kate, we want to be with her. Both of her. The clone nodded fervently. Of course. He laughed nervously. And of course I'm ready. Everything's fine. His eyes darted around the yard, as if he was searching for an escape route. Pier felt his chest tighten. He said evenly, You don't have to go ahead if you don't want to. You know that. You can bail out right now, if that's what you'd prefer. The clone looked more alarmed than ever. I don't want that. I want to stow away with Kate. He hesitated, then added, She'll be happier in there, more secure, and I do want to be with her. I want to know that side of her. Then what's wrong? The clone sank to his knees in the dirt. For a second, Peter thought he was sobbing. Then he realized that the noise was laughter. The clone recovered his composure and said, Nothing's wrong. But how do you expect me to take it? The two of us, cut off from everything else. Not just the real world, but all of the other copies. Piers said, If you get lonely, you can always generate new people. You'll have access to ontogenesis software, and no reason to care about the slowdown. The clone started laughing again. Tears streamed down his face. Hugging himself, he tumbled sideways onto the ground. Pier looked on, bemused. The clone said, Here I am trying to steel myself for the wedding, and already you're threatening me with children. Suddenly, he reached out and grabbed Pier by one ankle, then dragged him off the step. Pier hit the ground on his arse with a jarring thud. His first instinct was to freeze the clone's power to interact with him, but he stopped himself. He was in no danger, and if his twin wanted to burn off some aggression on his brother creator, he could take it. They were evenly matched, after all. 2 minutes later, Pier was lying with his face in the dirt and his arms pinned behind his back. The clone kneeled over him, breathless but triumphant. Pier said, All right, you win. Now get off me, or I'll double my height, put on 40 kilograms, and get up and flatten you. The clone said, Do you know what we should do? Shake hands and say goodbye. Toss a coin. For what? The clone laughed. What do you think? You said you were happy to go. I am. But so should you be. I say we toss a coin. If I win, we swap key numbers. That's illegal. Illegal? The clone was contemptuous. Listen to the Solipsist Nation copy invoke the laws of the world. It's easily done. The software exists. All you have to do is agree. Talking was difficult. Pier spat out sand, but there was a seed of some kind caught between his teeth, which he couldn't dislodge. He felt a curious reluctance to cheat, though, to remove the seed from his mouth or the clone from his back. It had been so long since he'd been forced to endure the slightest discomfort that the novelty seemed to outweigh the inconvenience. He said, All right, I'll do it. And if he lost? But why should he fear that? 5 minutes ago, he'd been prepared to give rise to become, the clone who'd stow away. They created the coin together, the only way to ensure that it was subject to no hidden influences. The reality editor they jointly invoked offered a standard object ready-made for their purpose, which they decorated as a 1-pound coin. The physics of flipping a real coin wouldn't come into it. Any copy could easily calculate and execute a flick of the thumb leading to a predetermined outcome. The result would be controlled by a random number generator deep in the hidden layers of the operating system. Pier said, I toss, you call, at exactly the same time as the clone. He laughed. The clone smiled faintly. Pier was about to defer, then decided to wait. A few seconds later, he said, alone, All right, you toss. As the coin went up, Pier thought about encasing it in a second object, an invisibly thin shell under his control alone. But the long list of attributes of the fair coin probably included crying foul if its true faces were concealed. He shouted, Heads! Just before the thing hit the dirt. The two of them fell to their hands and knees, almost bumping heads. A hen approached. Pier shooed it away with a backward kick. President Kinnock, in profile, glinted in the dust. The clone met his eyes. Pier did his best not to look relieved, short of severing ties with his body. He tried to read the clone's expression, and failed. All he saw was a reflection of his own growing numbness. Pirandello had said it was impossible to feel any real emotion while staring into a mirror. Pier decided to take that as a good sign. They were still one person, after all, and that was the whole point. The clone rose to his feet, dusting off his knees and elbows. Pier took a hologram embossed library card from the back pocket of his jeans and handed it over. It was an icon for a copy of all the environments, customized utilities, bodies, memories, and other data he'd accumulated since his resurrection. The clone said, "Don't worry about me, or Kate. We'll look after each other. We'll be happy." As he spoke, he morphed smoothly into an older body. Pier said, "Ditto." He reached up and shook the young man's hand. Then he summoned one of his control windows and froze the clone, leaving the motionless body visible as an icon for the snapshot file. He shrunk it to a height of a few centimeters, flattened it into a two-dimensional postcard, and wrote on the back, "To Malcolm Carter." Then he walked down the road a kilometer to one of Kate's little touches, a postbox marked U.S. Mail, and dropped the postcard in. Oh, geez, that's a long chapter. I was considering going and reading on further, but I have some stuff I got to get done. If that chapter were like half the length, I would do it, but I can't right now. So yeah, that'll do it for today. Hopefully people enjoyed. I know I certainly did. We're getting into some really interesting territory here, as you can see. Things are getting weird. I don't know how I feel anymore. There we go. Oh, that's really short though. Oh, I see. That's the part. That's the problem. I guess next week we'll hit part 2. Halfway through the stream. That's fine. I'll live. I'll live. Yeah. Reasonable assumption that it'll be 2 more streams before we're done. They'll be longish. We'll see. Anyway, hopefully people are enjoying. It's a wild book, mostly in terms of just bonkers ideas, and the execution thereof is phenomenal. He has truly thought of most everything to cover most contingencies. Assuming you are able to work with the whole dust theory thing, which I don't think I could adequately explain or properly explain because I'm not totally sure how thoroughly I understand it myself. My understanding is the basic gist of the dust theory in this case is pretty much as stated in the book, which is something along the lines of a conscious pattern, or really any pattern, I guess, can continue making itself realized, but and keep experiencing itself, its own continuity, regardless of if its constituent atoms are forming it, all in one place and at one time, is kind of the gist, which kind of takes a nice solid chisel to the walls of reality as we understand them and says, hey, by the way, you'll just keep being you. Sort of get into questions of an immortal soul and a few other things along that line. Anyway, that'll do it for today. This Friday we will be doing The Dark Forest, more of The Dark Forest by Shijin Liu. We've actually got the plot underway now. It will be a somewhat short one, though, I regret to say, because we'll be hitting part 2 somewhere during that, and I've got a bunch going on. This week's a little busy for me, but I'm going to still fit in the streams, no problem. What do we touch on here? I don't think we're going to hit... Okay, so we are going to hit... It's going to be kind of skeezy o'clock. Things are going to get weird. I think we are going to hit our first wall breaker, but I'm not sure. Anyway, Hopefully people will enjoy that. Next Monday we'll keep reading Yukikaze. This weekend I will get everything divvied up into their appropriate whatchamacallums, playlists. Even though some of these are only halfway done, and then I'll start for next week. I'll start doing new playlists for the year for Free Read Fridays. So I have to remember to do Volume 3 and Season 3 for Mecha Mondays and Free Read Fridays. I'll probably keep Wordy Wednesday. I'll set up a Wordy Wednesdays 2025 one for this week going forward. So it's not a perfect organizational schema, but it's one of the only ways I think I can do this because I have such a large amount of material that's on the channel to get it into further subdivided stuff for broad strokes division without being like 200 videos long. So it's just do it by year. I think it's going to be easier that way. But I'll also be doing for each book. There'll be a playlist for each book, and once I'm done with the Remembrance of Earth's Past and Pandora Sequence series, I'm going to have a playlist for all of those as well. That's an individual, like, here's one for the whole series. I did that for the Southern Reach trilogy and for the Starfish trilogy. Rifters trilogy, sorry. So I will do that again. I thought there was some other salient thing. Oh, Peter Watts has COVID. He's gotten it before, apparently, but this is like a newer variant and it's really kicking his ass, so I hope he keeps doing well. I don't know if he's on the mend, last I saw. Oh, hello. YouTube is telling me you can now choose if you want to allow third-party companies to use your content to train AI models in studio settings under third-party training. View in settings. No, do not allow third-party companies to train AI models using my channel content. Ever. Not that they'd ever listen to that, because I don't think I'd have a legal recourse for getting back at them unless I was able to get a class action suit going, and good luck with that. I don't have the resources. Let's, out of interest, let's read through this. Your content and third-party training. YouTube's commitment to responsible AI development, there's a hyperlink there, whatever that means. I'm not going to look at it right now. Includes making sure creators and rights holders continue to control how their content is used. Some creators and rights holders may want to partner with AI companies to help develop the latest generative AI technology. If they choose to, creators and rights holders can allow third-party companies that are building AI models to use their YouTube videos for AI model training. To do this, they can turn on third-party training settings and select which companies to allow. How about none of them, ever? Content eligibility. Here we go. Content is eligible for third-party training if the applicable right holders on the video allow third-party training, video privacy setting is public, and video complies with YouTube's terms of service and community guidelines. Which, I'm not sure if they wouldn't. Yeah, third-party training settings can be changed anytime. There can be a delay of up to 7 days. So, would they pay me for that? No, they wouldn't? Oh, shocker. Oh, here we go. Frequently asked questions. How will a third-party company use my content? When you allow third-party training, it means YouTube may share your eligible videos with a third-party company for purposes of training the AI models they're building. Keep in mind that third-party companies may not end up using your content, even if you allow them to. Also, because third-party companies are separate from YouTube/Google, ultimately we can't control what a third-party company does, thereby absolving ourselves of any guilt of having, I don't know, AI-generated weapon systems, Skynet, using my voice to send out a war cry and blow up people in Gaza, for instance. All third-party companies. What companies does that include? Selecting all third-party companies means you're allowing any third-party company, even if they're not listed. including insert government here. Will I get paid? Here we go. They actually have the question. Will I get paid if I allow third-party companies to train their AI models on my content? YouTube isn't facilitating payments between third-party companies and creators or other rights holders at this time. Oh, God, that was the most vile laugh I think I've exuded in a while. That translates in English to, no, go blank yourself in the redacted, is what that translates to. Not that I would do it even if they were offering to pay me. Sure, I guess the novelty of... So the problem is, my problem is that I don't want what happened to Lenny Clark in the course of Maelstrom to occur using me as the meltdown Madonna. I do not want this at this time. I know, just the legalese language they use makes me so mad. It's like I'm laughing because I'm really furious. It's just like, of course, oh, at this time, right? Ever. Why even include it as a possibility? We all know. We all know. Anyway, let me make sure this is turned off. And again, I don't have a great deal of trust, to be honest, that they wouldn't actually be doing it anyway. So I'm glad they're pretending that they're offering the option, but I don't believe them. Here we go. Yes, it definitely says third-party training is not checked. Very good. Anyway, Happy New Year to you too, Dr. Fidu. Fidu? Fido? I apologize. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Anyway, so yeah, hopefully not Greg Egan, Peter Watts. How's Peter Watts doing? Is he, yeah, no, he's got, oh, and he updated a bunch of cover art stuff, which is a little late for me, but because I've already posted most of the cover art for his stuff. Some of them is really good, or fan art rather, not cover art. Some of these are awesome. Also, somebody did an animated .gif of Yuka Sarasti with what appear to be cat ears for some reason. I don't know why. People are interesting that way. Anyway, hopefully he will start getting better soon, because I really want him to finish the next book in the Blindopraxia series, which I think is tentatively titled Omniscience. He's been pretty busy, actually, so there's a reason the book's not out yet, 10 years down, or so. So I don't know if anybody watched. I haven't. If anybody watched it's a series that came out, I think, on Amazon Prime called Secret Level, which I had no real interest in because I just saw no way for it to be all that good. But apparently, there's an episode revolving around Armored Core, and apparently, my boy, Peter Watts wrote the short story that wound up being based on. He was commissioned to write a short story, Armored Core adjacent, and he did that. And everyone I've talked to who has seen it claims that that's one of the only episodes that's worth watching. And so I'm like, oh, I'm glad. On the one hand, he has exactly one piece of prior experience in the mecha genre, which would be this doing like the world building background work for a VR game called Underdogs, I think it was called. I don't have it in front of me, so I don't know. Yes, Happy New Year to you too, Josh Kerr. But anyway, so now he's got 2 under his belt, and frankly, I hadn't really ever considered, hey, could Peter Watts write, mecha fiction? And it's, well, clearly he can. And could Peter Watts write something that was like in the Armored Core universe? And clearly he can. So I'm happy for him. But I'd never really considered it because it just seems like a very strange pick. But at the same time, it's also oddly fitting because Armored Core in general is very cynical. Like the first Armored Core, I think the first mission of the first Armored Core has you choosing whether to put down a workers' strike or putting down, I think, student protesters. That's like your first mission of the game. And by put down, I mean with extreme prejudice using a giant robot. It's like there's nothing happy scrappy about Armored Core at all. So this seems like the kind of cynical thing he could probably get himself around to doing. But anyway, so I have plugged Peter Watts enough. Um, After we're finished with Permutation City in 2 more weeks, by February, we will be starting to read through Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer. And I know a bunch of people have asked, what did you think about it? And I'm going to kind of save that. I have opinions. There's some things I like. There's so little that I can say without spoiling the entire thrust of the book, and I really don't want to do that. Suffice it to say, it feels like he has taken some of the ideas that he was sort of working around with in Dead Astronauts, and which is the second full book, I think, in the Born Born series, which is like the first book, Born, is a bedazzlement. It is a very strange book, but a very awesome book. And then Dead Astronauts happens, and you're like, wait a minute, what? And this is kind of like that for the Area X series. And that's the Southern Reach trilogy was filled with wait a minute, what moments. This one has a lot of wait a minute, what moments. I mean, a lot that like recontextualize everything, and we had some of those already. Just about every single book had some massive recontextualization event. This does it like twice. Anyway, I'm looking forward to it. I know some other people are. Um, Probably the majority of the commenters from the last year are probably like, or from the last half year, I should say, are, when are you going to get around to reading this aloud? It's out, read it. I'm like, yes, I will. I need to read it first. I did. I read it. It's through. I've read it. It's good. I'd love to have read it again before I read it aloud, but we'll get there. Not pictured. Frag moving his hands in a "we'll get there" motion, which is hard to explain. They're kind of like two backslashes going off to the side. It's never mind. Yeah. So happy New Year to everyone. Y'all got hit with the metaphysical installments of Permutation City. Let's mess with your head just a smidge. Open your mind. It's a mind-opening experience. That's what I love about Greg Egan, particularly around when he was writing in this time period. He's got some stuff that just makes your head explode. I would say for the record that I do not recommend Secret Level the series. I have not seen it. I cannot vouch for it. Um, Somebody on Twitch is posting robo spammy garbage. Cool. Never mind. I have not seen it. I had no interest in seeing it, even though I'm a longtime Armored Core fan. I'm like, I just don't think anybody making plots and scripts for movies, for TV series, or even if they're for what have you, um, I don't think what they're interested in making has any dramatic overlap with what I'm interested in watching out of something made inspired by. The one other episode I've heard recommended is the Pac-Man episode because it's somebody probably did a lot of drugs, and I haven't seen it, so I don't know, and I probably won't see it anytime soon. I have a backlog a mile long of both reading and other things I need to watch, so it's not in the cards at this point. Probably within the first month of this year, I'll try and get a some kind of a Discord channel or something up. And then I have to remember to actually include it in my stream description and links, which I will totally forget to do. Probably, knowing recent past history. so people can actually talk to me there, because otherwise I am not terribly communicative. Uh, Nicole Verlino says, I saw a couple episodes, not worth it. My general impression from what I'd seen of Secret Level as a show was kind of a vapid, pointless excuse and a waste of money. Like, I'm happy if the Armored Core episode is good because Greg Egan, Jesus, Peter Watts was involved, so I'm like, yay! I hope that's good because I like Peter Watts. But at the same time, if it's not, it doesn't change my impression at all of my going into the show, and you can't win them all. Um, the one work I have not read that's an actual proper novel by Peter Watts that I have not read on stream was he did the novelization for I think it was the Crisis 2 tie-in novel. And I can't remember the name of that off the top of my head. It's just outside my field of vision. I can't tell. So, highlights for this year going forward. What do I want to do for this year? What do I want to do for this year? Well, we're going to get through the rest of the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy by Shijin Liu, which is the last 2/3 roughly of The Dark Forest and the Death's End. Death's End? Pretty sure that's the name of the third volume. We are not going to read the semi-official fan fiction fourth volume. We're not doing it. Sorry. I didn't think it was that good, and it's definitely fan fiction. And it's not the author. So there. We're also going to get through the rest of the Pandora sequence by Bill Ransom and Frank Herbert. After I get through those, I would very much like to do some of the Culture novels by Ian M. Banks. I would probably just start from the top, even though Consider Phlebas is probably the roughest of the entire lot. I'd still have to start with it because mostly because the idea of, oh, you've come up with this kind of this absolutely brilliant utopia, and the first book you write set in the universe in which this utopia exists, this utopian society exists, is from the perspective of a character who is actively antagonistic towards that utopian society. I think that's a brilliant conceit, and I don't think there's anyone out there who is that bold and has the details of their internal world that they've invented that secure that they're able to do that and still come out on top. Frank Herbert maybe could have done it because in its way, certainly the first couple volumes of the Dune series are, I mean, it's like you start out with the idea and then the entire reason you read Dune in many cases is to get to Dune Messiah. As hard as that book can be to get through, it's like Dune Messiah is so brilliant in how it just kind of takes everything you thought you understood, even though you've been told already, and been like, hey, by the way, this guy who's sort of the hero born in the last book, he's in charge of a massively genocidal regime. It's the worst. It's really bad, and he knows it, and he knew it going in. And it could have been worse, and it could have been better. He didn't go far enough, his son says. I'd love to read Dune on here, but so many other people have done it aloud and done it justice better than I could ever hope to because they've got like full cast recordings and they're brilliant. There's some really good ones out there. I don't know which I'd probably do like a couple, like a three or so of the Culture novels. I don't think we'd get as far as say Accession as much as I would want to read that one, and I'm not going to skip around. I do kind of want to do some of the Lensman series. I haven't decided how I'll do that. My gut says I'll start with Galactic Patrol and then do like Triplanetary and First Lensman afterwards, but there's some good moments in both, so I don't know. Anyway, thank you for tuning in, Toby Frost. Yes, we're at the wind up portion, the end part. I know starting at 12 is starting at noon Eastern Standard Time is tough. For most people to tune in live, but I don't expect people to. When I see as many as I saw today, it's rather a pleasant surprise. So yeah, I'd like to do some Lensman. What was the other? Somebody wanted something out of me. Oh yes, I have to get around to actually reading that though. Somebody wanted me to read a book called Street Lethal by Stephen Barnes, and I haven't gotten around to it yet. Um, I hope to start reading that on my own time in the next month or so. Um, and then I can read that one aloud. There was something else. What was it? Oh, for Mecha Mondays, I'll probably do start doing some of Full Metal Panic after we're done with Yukikaze as something a lighter fare. Lighter fare. We'll do Good Luck Yukikaze as well at some point. Um, oh, and I was not crazy. There is a fourth book in the Yukikaze series. It is called Aggressor or Aggressors. Yes. Wikipedia doesn't have it listed, so further reinforcement that you should take what you see on Wikipedia with a grain of salt. I knew there was another one. It was back in like April of 22. It came out. Uh, and I think most of the Yukikaze series has been serialized in one form or another. I don't know if all of them have. And I forget the magazine. It's a sci-fi magazine in Japan that I'd love to get translated, but no joy. Um, There's a bunch of other Mecha Mondays stuff that I'd like to do. Oh, I need to check to see when the 50th anniversary of Macross is coming up. That's probably sooner than I'd like, because Macross 30 came out a while back. Macross, what was that? When did that come out? 82. So we're getting there. We're getting there. Jeez Louise, are we getting there? Um, I don't want to save it that late, but there's some stuff I want to do for Macross. There's not much Macross books I can do. There's my text. There it is. Yeah, we got another 7 years before the 50th. Who knows? We might actually get a new Macross series that isn't mediocre like Delta was. Anyway, yeah, so for Wordy Wednesdays stuff, the next thing on the immediate horizon is going to be, as I said before, Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer. After that, I don't know. I'll figure it out. I'll find something to read. God knows I have enough. I have so much. So much. At some point, I'd love to do that comic book reading idea. I did it once with one of the old Dark Horse Alien comics, and it's I don't know. I don't know how well that works as a format. I think it would be fun, but some of the stuff I want to do, I don't know. I'd love to do the Finder library, but there's a by oh, what's her name, Carla Speed McNeil. There's rather a lot of sex in that, so that might not get past censors. It's not terribly graphic, but it's there. Some nudity. It's not a lot, but it's there. Uh, some great stories though. Oh my gosh. I wish she'd keep writing those, but I think she had a kid. I think so. She's I think semi-retired. Good for her. Says I. She came up with some brilliant work with that series. There was some probably some William Gibson. I know people have asked for Neuromancer, and at this point, why not? Right? I've read some of the hardest things already that I've got in my collection that are to read. C.J. Sherry. I haven't done C.J. Sherry in a year. I need to do more. So there. Ha. You're gonna get it. Probably I would do Down Below Station. Since chronologically that one's kind of important. Realistically, excuse me, I should have started with Down Below Station, but the couplet of Heavy Time and Hellburner is so good. I love that duology, and you don't need prior knowledge from Down Below Station going into that. Some of the short stories and novels surrounding that immediate time period require a little bit more Down Below Station knowledge, mostly to understand the setting. Whereas those two, because of the way they work as a prequel, I don't feel it's as mandatory. And we get like, I don't know, there's a couple names that pop back up that are characters that you learn more about or encounter again in Down Below Station, but their role is so changed that it really doesn't matter. I wouldn't worry about it too much. So I'd probably do Down Below and then probably not Tri Point. What's that other one? Jeez Louise. One sec. I can just barely see it, but I can't quite. What is the name of it? It's not Tri Point, but it's one of those. Oh, yes, here we go. Where are you? There you are. Merchanter's Luck, I'd like to do, and there's another one um, that I can't remember the name of for some reason, and I can't see my copy of for some reason. Wah! I have it here somewhere. I don't know where it is. Sorry. Anyway, I really want to get around to Cytine and Regenesis, but before those, I would have to read 40,000 at Gehenna, in Gehenna, sorry. Um, Not strictly mandatory. You wouldn't need them, but what happens in 40,000 in Gehenna is fairly important to some political developments that occur in Cytine and Regenesis. Um, and they're good. There's some kind of squicky stuff that happens in Cytine and Regenesis, but we'll muscle through it. Mostly in terms of using people for certain things and in certain ways that's pretty uncomfortable, but that's kind of the point. They're not being done as, oh, these are fine and totally okay things to have done. They're not. They're not in any way okay. That's the point. The person that did those things is not a nice person. And it's to contrast with certain other characters. Anyway, it'll make sense when we get there. Oh, yes, I got through Carrion Comfort by Dan Simmons at some point this past year. I think it was over the summer. I don't remember now. It's been a long year. God, has it been a long year. So I'll probably get to that at some point this year, but I don't know. This is all indefinite future stuff. Have you read any of Gregory Benford's Galactic Center series? I have not. The name Gregory Benford is vaguely familiar. Benford. Let me real quick skim his bibliography here. Okay, I've clicked on his bibliography at some point in the past, which means somebody, probably you, has recommended it to me before, and I need to get around to it. Oh, he worked on some of the Manxin Wars stuff. Oh, okay, that might be how the name is vaguely familiar. Let's see. Let's see. Anything obvious here that's familiar? Other than the Manxin stuff. Which is just kind of detailing interactions between the human race and the Xinti. I think I read the short story that the Xinti lesson comes from, which is any space sufficiently powerful space drive is equally useful as a weapon. That one I believe is by Larry Niven, and there have since been a bunch, and I mean a bunch, of short stories written in that general vein. Galactic Center Saga. In the Ocean of Night. Sailing Bright Eternity sounds familiar, but none of the rest of them do. Actually, I might have Great Sky River. I take it back. Nope. 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 I've never read that. Never mind. I will have to look into those. Let me find my magical mystical turbo document, and let's get that added in there. Or find out that I already did it, or added it in there, and just haven't gotten around to it yet. I always take suggestions, by the way. I just have to find where I put the Frasum. There it is. Okay. Okay. We're getting through Destination Void. Getting through 3 body. Old Man's War I need to reread. Actually, I don't think I've read the second book or the third book of that anyway, so I have to get around to that. Street Lethal. Somebody asked for The Alchemist, which I have not gotten around to, but I had it available and almost purchased it. Okay, so I do not have Gregory Benford yet. So let's get Gregory Benford in here. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Galactic Center Saga. That's with an A, yes. By Gregory Benford. Adding things to the list. I know I've read something by this guy, though. I wouldn't recognize the name, and I wouldn't, I don't think, recognize it from the Man Xin stuff, because I can barely remember half the people that contributed to that. Of course, that's how I knew Stephen Barnes, was he had done stuff with Larry Niven, so I recognized that. Anyway, doesn't matter. If I can't remember, that doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot. So that just means that getting old sucks. The second thing you lose when you're getting old is your memory, and I cannot remember the first, as they say. So I will look into those. Those are all from Bantam, it looks like, except for one that appears to be from Simon & Schuster. There might be an omnibus. I'll have to look. I will look into those. Thank you for the suggestion. I will look into them. That's it. I've yammered for about half an hour now. That's enough. I will see you all later. You want the list? It's not that big. I mean, none of this is getting into stuff that's on my personal to-read list. Oh, I will be done with The Nightland shortly. Actually, I'm done with that, but I haven't read it aloud. Yeah, if I get that Discord thing up, people can do that. If people don't want to use Discord, that's good too. Otherwise, you can just communicate to me through comments. I maintain a low to non-existent social media presence, as people have probably noticed. I do tend to post on various fora as Fragath, but that's about it. None of it, so far as I know, is connected to my actual real human meat space name. So that I can think of. You would have difficulty connecting me to me, as it were. Which is why I don't try to act like a total asshole on the internet. Because there's no point. It's not that big, actually, but the list is right now to be read aloud, I should say. Destination Void or Pandora Sequence series by Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom, Three Body Problem trilogy or Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy by Shijin Liu, Old Man's War by Scalzi, Quantum Thief by Rajaniemi, Slaughterhouse 5 by Vonnegut. This is all stuff to read on stream, and I unfortunately have to reread in most of these cases stuff that I either don't have in my collection anymore or borrow from the library or whatever. Before I read it aloud, I need a refresher so I can remember what's going on. Brave New World by Huxley. I have my copy of that floating around. Gravity's Rainbow by Pinchon, which I don't have. House of Leaves by Danielewski. Hainish Cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin. I might actually have that. Neuromancer by Gibson. I'm going to include the entire Sprawl trilogy at that point, which is. I've already done Burning Chrome, which has the short story that Johnny Mnemonic is based on. But the Sprawl trilogy includes Neuromancer, it includes Count Zero, and it includes Mona Lisa Overdrive. Wild things there. Turn of the Screw by Henry James. Orphans of the Sky by Heinlein. The Forever War by Haldeman. The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson. Street Lethal by Stephen Barnes. Vampires with a $ for an S by John Stakely, which is the only other novel I think he ever wrote beyond Armor. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, Coelho, and now the Galactic Center Saga. I'm forgetting something here. There's something I know I had in here. It was a trilogy. What was it? Oh, Street Lethal is the trilogy. Somebody asked. I have to actually read it first. Should not promise that I will read it aloud, but I will at least look into it. What little I know of it indicates that it is going to be a shockingly difficult book to read aloud, because it hops around a bit and it's a bit baffling in terms of structure. But I rather enjoy books with a baffling structure. I recommend. For a book that has some fun with structure but is still basically a conceptually clear narrative, I recommend. It's called The Revisionaries, and I cannot remember the author name. Is it Moxon? The Revisionaries. A.R. Moxon. Moxon. The Revisionaries. It's good. It's fun. It plays with some ideas. It's pretty long, too. It's a beefy book. Speaking of beefy books, I'd kind of like to read the, what is it called? The Night's Dawn trilogy, I think it's called, by Peter F. Hamilton. But each volume of that is like frickadoodles, 700-800 pages. It'd take me a long time to get through them. I'd have to take breaks in between because I couldn't just spend the entire year just doing those 3 books for one of the days a week. Anyway, it's a fun. The Revisionaries by A.R. Moxon is quite fun, and I recommend it for if you like books that are play around with how a book can be structured. Mostly in terms of using a novel as also a visual format without actually being a graphic novel. It'll make sense when you get there, and it's cute. Stuff that I couldn't easily translate. I'd have to like show pictures or explain. Anyway, it's a fun book with fun characters. What it reminded me of actually quite a bit was was stuff by the Illuminatus trilogy and the Schrodinger's Cat trilogy by oh my gosh, why can't I remember your name? I can't remember his name, so now we have to look it up. Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea. There we go. Those could be a fun read. I think they're fun. I think they're entertaining, but like they're not terribly appropriate. Like they get it on. People are doing things in those books. Yowzers. Still fun. There's also like a bunch of books after the original trilogy that I think he did. They did. But I'm not sure how many there are. I know I've only read those 3 that I know of. Yeah, Robert Wilson. Thank you. I'm sorry. My brain definitely reached capacity for names and objects a little while ago, and I feel it all the time now. Where I'm like, oh, I can't remember now. Good times. Uh, Getting old sucks. Has anybody mentioned this? I can't remember. We already did that joke. Okay, I'm quitting. That's 40 minutes of yammering about the upcoming year. I hope people have enjoyed everything up until the yammering. And yeah, that reminds me, I'm going to have to make sure I have downloaded copies of all of these. Yep, I got to do that. So stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. The next however long is going to be rough, but we're going to get through it. We're going to get through it. And if it makes you feel any better, even if we set off our entire nuclear arsenal all at once, we still probably wouldn't wipe out the human race. Civilization? Toast. The planet? Basically fine. The ecosphere? Fucked. Humanity? Probably boned. But at the same time, dude, we're like cockroaches, man. We'll survive in one form or another. You might not. I probably won't. But hey, look on the bright side. Never mind. Man, that took a turn. Anyway, until next time, toodaloo. I'll try not to be a depressing negative Nancy in the future. He said. What was that other book? There's some cyberpunk adjacent series that I wanted to read. Ugh. Oh, I want to read The Body Scout. I enjoyed the hell out of that. That book was fun. I got to read that on stream. That one was cute. I liked that one. I don't remember the author name. I can't make it out from here. It's upside down. And I'm not wearing my glasses. Shit, you just told him that you wear glasses. You fool! I read a lot of books. You're goddamn right I have glasses. But I'm nearsighted, so I don't need them for reading. Lincoln Vincent? Something like that. Lincoln Michael? Michelle? I can't make it out from here. It's too far away. Sorry. I gotta read that on stream. That'll be fun. That's a cute book.